Okay, welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture. We'll be talking about personal archives, intervention, and the search for authenticity. So here are weekly topics for this week. What are personal archives? How can the way that archivists approach collecting personal archives differ from traditional archival materials? And what influence has the nature of electronic records had on collecting personal archives? We'll be looking at 4 of our course learning objectives: defining core concepts and principles, evaluate the role that records creators play, looking at the different aspects of archival practice and how they connect and relate to each other, and looking at our factors that have influenced the evolution of the archival profession. Okay, so we'll start by something that we've discussed a fair amount already in this semester, which is trust, and how the connection between archives and donors, especially as it relates to personal archives, is one that benefits a great deal from donors having trust in archives and understanding archives and feeling that archives will act in an ethical manner when making record keeping decisions surrounding the care of records that donors donate to archives. So archives can establish trust through having codes of ethics and statement values, being transparent about what they do and why they do it and how they do it, and overall acting in a trustworthy manner, not having scandals that are all over the headlines, or doing things like violating donor agreements, and just generally speaking, not keeping their word. So if people are more trusting of archives, as I just touched on, it can really improve the relationship between donors and archives. And that can lead to donors who are more willing to donate materials to archives. And it can also reduce the self-censorship by donors. So in a little bit, we'll talk about the archiving eye and the archived eye, which one of the Douglas articles from this week mentioned. And we'll talk about how a trust in archives can decrease the impact that these two factors have on the quality of archival collections. Okay, and so if donor relations are improved, this can result in a few successes. So collections can contain more useful and engaging information. More use can be made of records, and archives can be seen as more valuable to society, or at least to the institution that houses the archives or supports the archives. So obviously records that haven't been self-censored by donors are going to contain records which have more research value. As I've talked about before, oftentimes it's the more private aspects of records within a collection where people are sort of more free with their opinion and more honest about their recollections and events that they went through or things that happened to them. That's where the real research value of collections is located. And if these kinds of records are stripped out by donors who don't have good relationships with archives and don't trust archives, then that can really impact the ability of the collection to contain useful and engaging information. And this rich information can, overall, it's just more useful. It's more valuable for academic articles. It's more valuable for documentaries and other uses that archival researchers might make of their records. If archives contain collections that have been stripped of all the rich detail and material within them, then that can undermine their ability to be seen as a valuable part of society or even a valid part of an institution. If archives really thrive on having collections that are, full of rich detail and are useful to people. If archives contain a bunch of collections that aren't being used because they don't contain any of the details about a person's life or a person's activities that researchers are really looking for, then that can certainly lead to society as a whole or an institution to question why an archive exists or what value it's really bringing to society. And obviously that's problematic for archives, especially when they are seeking the resources that they need to thrive as information repositories. So we'll start by looking at some of the characteristics of personal archives, and we'll talk about how these characteristics or the thoughts around personal archives have changed over time, or perhaps how they should change. So these characteristics of personal archives are from the Douglas and Mills article on pages 259 and 260. So they talk about how typically personal archives are thought of as being created for personal reasons. They're not thought of as being linked to services or any kind of what was the word I'm looking for? Any kind of interaction with sort of financial transactions. Yeah, that's the best I can come up with right now. They're thought of as being typically generated by an individual or perhaps even individuals. They're not thought of as being legal or administrative. They're typically considered to be subjective and emotional and fairly narrow in scope. So the recollections of just one person or perhaps a group of people, and not something that that really has much of an interaction with the rest of society. So you think of an organization that might have a broad scope that might document an interaction with, many aspects of society. At least theoretically, personal archives are thought of as being a bit more narrow in the connections between the records and other people or other parts of society. The Pollard article lists some things that personal archives are typically thought of as including. So we have letters, memoirs and reminiscences, diaries, scrapbooks, and photograph albums, professional papers, genealogical information, speeches and lectures, labeled photographs, labeled films, video, and audio tapes. The labeled is probably kind of aspirational. Most archivists have come across just a mass of photographs or audio tapes or other materials that have no label at all. And so, you might have no idea who is represented within those photographs or what is going on in those photographs. But these are some of the things that are typically thought of as being included in personal archives. So I have a piece of pizza here in my background because I used to know an archivist who worked at the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, and Andy Warhol liked to create what he called time capsules. And so a time capsule was when he would sweep off whatever happened to be on his desk at the moment into a box and, seal it up. And a lot of those ended up in his archive, which the museum has. So this archivist was describing, opening these time capsules and finding like moldy pizza crusts and other just kind of random stuff that Andy had happened to had on his desk at the time and just kind of swept into a box. And so I guess the long and short of it is that personal archives can be pretty diverse. And uh, typically more diverse than what might be thought of as being organizational archives. So you might have things like ephemera, so pamphlets, booklets, clothes, artifacts. Personal archives can be quite diverse. The Pollard article mentions some interesting connections between personal archives and appraisal. The article talks about how the appraisal of personal archives has been a neglected area of appraisal scholarship, and that's because governmental and corporate archives have been seen as a primary focus of appraisal, while personal archives have largely been excluded from the discourse. So that's something Pollard mentions on page 138. However, Pollard argues that this is unfortunate because evidential value can be found in personal archives. However, traditionally, it was mainly thought to only be found in institutional records. So there is this thought that institutional organizational records are where you could find good evidence of a person's activities because they're thought of as being sort of more authoritative and impartial and unbiased. But Pollard feels that personal archives can have evidential value as well. So Pollard feels that there's little guidance on which people within society should have their papers targeted for acquisition. So there hasn't been as much discourse on whose recollections might be important to collect and provide access to into the future. And Pollard feels that a result of this is that archives have typically collected a specific type of personal archives and neglected others. This is something that I've heard about a fair amount in archives and read about, where personal archives represented within archives tend to be only of people who are famous or are well-known individuals, and that's resulted in less of a collection of people who are just kind of normal day-to-day people like most of us are. And obviously it's entertaining and interesting to have the perspective of people who are well known and who many people feel like they might have some connection with, but it's the day-to-day experiences of people that document what history was like for a vast majority of us. So if you're only collecting one and you're not collecting the other, then you can have an archive that doesn't really represent society, but rather represents just a very small minority of people and of society. So obviously this can be problematic if you want your archives to represent society or represent an event or an organization or a moment in time as thoroughly and comprehensively as possible. So to go back to the definition or the characteristics of personal archives that the Douglas and Mills article describes. So again, typically created for personal reasons, not linked to services or transactions, generated by an individual or individuals, not legal or administrative, tend to be thought of as subjective and emotional, typically thought of as being narrow in scope. I think that Pollard would argue that personal records may be subjective and emotional, but they still are capable of serving of evidence, and they're still capable of having evidential value, even though there's, supposedly subjectivity inherent in personal archives. And I think that you can make an argument that there is a lot of subjectivity in personal archives. Everyone is going to recall and relay things from their own perspective, and sometimes in an emotional way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that these recollections can't serve as evidence of, what was happening in society, or the activities of other people or other organizations. The Mills and Douglas article argues that in a lot of ways, thinking of personal archives as only having these characteristics is really limiting and can actually be quite damaging, not only for the people who are represented in records that aren't thought of as being personal, but also for society as a whole. And they would argue that personal archives should be thought of in a broader and more inclusive scope. So the traditional thought of personal archives is that the records that document a person's life should be under their control. It's sort of their property. They can do with it what they want. And an organizational records should be under control of whatever organization creates and uses them. But the Douglas and Mills article talks about how oftentimes there's an overlap between a person's life and an organization, and records that are created and maintained by that organization. So this sort of gray area where a person's life interacts with an organization, and the person is represented within organizational records. And so typically, because these records haven't been thought of as being personal archives, the person represented within these records has had no control over record-keeping decisions surrounding what happens to these records. So no control over who has access to the records, how the records are preserved, how they're arranged and described, how they're appraised, and so on. And this is something that Mills and Douglas think is very problematic. And they describe personal archives as being records that can be captured by people or organizations, so not just people, records that may be linked to services, records that can be generated by individuals or organizations, records that may be legal or administrative, and may document a broad scope of society. So they feel that these records that document a person's life, but may have been created by an organization, should be considered a person's personal archives, and that a person represented within organizational records should have some say and some control over record-keeping decisions that are made with regard to those records. So decisions over how the records should be arranged and described, how the records should be accessed, who the records should be accessed by, maybe preservation decisions surrounding the records. And this discussion really works against the perception of personal archives that has been prevalent in the archival profession really since it started. And it's one that seeks to erase the binary between personal and organizational archives, and argues that some organizational records are personal. And they're personal not just in the context of their creation, as Douglas notes on page 274, but they can also be personal through how those represented in the records use them and perceive them. So personal and organizational records can be personal since they impact people, and it doesn't necessarily matter who created the records if they document a part of a person's life that may be really emotional and maybe intimate. So the Douglas and the Douglas and Mills article talks about attempting to access records related to the stillbirth of her daughter, which I can't even imagine how awful that would be to go through and to look at and really investigate. And it's clear that going through the process of requesting the records and looking at these records is very personally intense for her. And so it really is unfortunate, and I would say cruel or cold-hearted to say, well, you don't really have any right to access these records, or you don't have a right to determine who can access these records or how they're accessed, because they do have such a strong resonance with a person and document an intensely personal part of a person's life. So Douglas would argue that it's the activation of records that make them personal, even if they were created by an organization and not the individual represented within the records. And I feel like there's certainly a lot of argument to be made, for this. There are some examples in the Douglas article. So children who were in foster care in Australia, obviously the foster care organizations created records about them, and you can really make the argument that those records are part of those individuals' personal archives. Again, they may not have created the records themselves, but they are represented within the records, and even more importantly, those records can document a very perhaps difficult time that they went through, and they should have some say in record keeping decisions surrounding those particular records. As an instructor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, I do a yearly evaluation over what I've done during the previous year, and even though that's technically an organizational record because it's something that I submit to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, it's me talking about what I've gone through the last year, how I've taught my classes, and so on. So there's a lot of me in those records, and so you could argue that because of that, I should have some say in who can access those records and other record keeping decisions. Obviously not nearly as powerful an example as being in foster care or having a stillbirth, but I think that it's still an argument nonetheless. The Mills and Douglas article talks about some of the benefits related to having a broader concept of what records should be considered a part of a person's personal archives. So I touched on one. So privacy is a big issue. If you are a person who has records represented or has, if you are a person and an organization has records about you and you aren't able to influence who can access them or who can look at them, then that can result in a loss of your privacy. There may be sensitive information in there that you don't feel comfortable with other people accessing, but you may not be able to have any kind of power over access decisions made surrounding those records. And as the Douglas and Mills article notes, this can result in exposure and surveillance of communities and community members who may have experienced exposure and surveillance in the past. And so for these community members to be able to have some control over how records related to their lives are represented and accessed in organizational records, it really gives them greater control over records related to them, and it gives back some of the power that has been taken away from them. So this reallocation of power from giant bureaucracies in state organizations to people who are represented in records is certainly a benefit towards reconceptualizing exactly what a personal record and what a personal archive is. And helping a person make decisions over record keeping decisions surrounding institutional records can be a really big thing, because institutional records might be the only records that survive, or the only records that have been collected by archives. And this is something that the Douglas and Mills article notes on page 271. So if there's only one perspective that has been collected throughout history, and this is the bureaucratic and organizational perspective, then that can have a strong role in influencing how people perceive a person or a community and society as a whole. And so it's important that people have some ability to push back against the representation of themselves and of their community that is found in organizational records. This is something that the Douglas and Mills article talks about on page 270 and 271. So if people have the power to make record-keeping decisions surrounding records that represent them in organizational archives, then it helps them push back against the past, respond to silences, and add missing context to records. Organizational archives are typically thought of as being impartial and bureaucratic, but as the Douglas and Mills article notes, this frequently is not the case. So everyone has a perspective, everyone has a narrative that they're trying to shape and support, and giant bureaucracies and organizations are no different. And so it's important that people represented within those records are able to contribute to those records and shape those records in a way that can expose the partiality of organizational records and allow for a more nuanced understanding of what an organization was up to and what people impacted by that organization experienced. So providing people with the power to shape record-keeping decisions surrounding records that represent them can really push back against this perspective of organizations as being objective and impartial. Again, by presenting an alternate perspective of what went on in society and what went on in history. A couple of factors that can influence the composition or the nature of personal archives are the archiving eye and the archived eye that the Douglas article for this week talked about. So the archiving eye is the person who is choosing what materials will represent the real person in their archives. So the person who says, okay, these are the records that I'm going to collect and donate to the archive and make accessible into the future. And as Douglas notes on page 69, The shaping of the archived eye is frequently carried out through the cleansing of personal elements via close control over what enters personal archives. So if a person feels like something might be too private, or if a person feels like they want history and understanding of them to be shaped in a particular way, then they may say, okay, well, I'm going to delete this hard drive, or I'm going to burn these letters, or get rid of this diary, or rewrite this diary, or there are a whole host of things that people can do during this archiving eye process. And one of the results of this archiving eye process, as Douglas notes on page 73, is it can make it very difficult to assess the extent to which an archive is reflective of its creator. So obviously, the more a person censors themselves and shapes their archives so that they reflect a certain narrative, the further away the representation of that person in an archive gets from the actual person and what the person actually did and who the person actually had a relationship and so on. So a lot of the important details about a person can be shaped in a way that isn't authentic and doesn't represent the person's actual life. And so this can result in an archived eye, or the person represented as a result of the archiving eye, that again isn't authentic and doesn't really represent the person's true life. On page 55, Douglas talks about coaxers and coercers, so parties that have shaped personal archives and developed the archived eye that researchers might encounter in archival repositories. So this may be the subject of the records, or it may be their family. So the Douglas article talks about Sylvia Plath and her archives, which is kind of an infamous example of the archived eye not really representing Sylvia Plath or her actual life. And that's because of different parties that intervened after Plath's death to shape the narrative about her life in a particular way, or to create an archived eye that fit a certain narrative. So her mother and her husband, or ex-husband, are ones that are mentioned as being people who were coaxers and coercers in this particular instance. So through this archiving eye and during the creation of the archived eye, as Douglas notes on page 55, personal archives are constrained and obscured by the writer's own efforts to conceal and edit the self, and by the imposition of intentions other than those of the writer on the archive. So again, there can be all these forces that can shape what the archived eye looks like. Interestingly enough, on page 67, Douglas connects the selection retention choices that the original creators of the records make with the decisions that archives make. So archives can contribute to the archived eye as well by choosing to only accept certain records that a person has created, or by arranging and inscribing records in a certain way, by preserving records in a certain way. This can contribute to the creation of the archived eye as well. But I guess we can at least hope that archives are making decisions about what the archived eye looks like based on at least reasonably objective and sort of professionally supported standards, and not just because they want a narrative to be shaped in a particular way. So archivists might have, or hopefully have, more objective reasons for making retention and selection choices, as opposed to the original creators of the records who, again, might be interested in having a certain perspective about themselves represented in archival collections. So the Douglas article focuses on personal archives when discussing the archiving eye, but it's certainly true that this idea can apply to organizations. So organizations might shape their records in a particular way to fit a particular narrative. This might be especially true in corporate archives, which essentially are just PR tools by corporations meant to highlight certain aspects of an organization's history and essentially serve as a commercial for an organization. So there can be a lot of archiving eye that can go on within organizations as well. This may be less of an issue because there are laws in place that can prevent the destruction of protected records. So this might reduce this archiving eye factors by organizations somewhat. And this certainly isn't true for personal archives. There's not a law that says that people have to retain their personal and private information in a particular way. People can do what they want with their property. And I think that that's something that most people would argue is a good thing, right? So especially with what is considered to be more personal archives, records creators can have a lot of influence in what the archived eye looks like. Another thing that can shape what the archived eye looks like is this concept of benign neglect, which the Becker and Nogues article talks about. So on page 486, the Becker and Nogues article describes benign neglect as a default approach to digital archiving that uses easily accessible everyday computing functions to back up one's digital belongings and operates with an inherent acceptance of incipient loss these practices often induce. And this incipient loss can be caused by a few things that the Becker and Nogues article mentions. So obsolete formats of records, file management, which is a big one that they focus on, and just an overall unfamiliarity with technology and computer technology. So looking at obsolete formats, format obsolescence and physical media failure can threaten the survival of files, as Becker and Nogues mentioned on page 483. So if you put your records on a hard drive and that's sort of your preservation system, but the hard drive decays and eventually becomes inaccessible, then that's a form of benign neglect, which is going to make those files less accessible in the future. If your files are on a format that is very difficult to access, then that would be another type of benign neglect. But overall, Becker and Nogues feel that a greater threat is the poor file management by records creators. So this would include things like poor naming practices that make records difficult to find. And that's certainly one that, most people would encounter on a day-to-day basis. You may save something that can have a very sort of vague or perhaps even nonsensical title, and that can make it difficult to understand exactly what the file is or how the file relates to other files within your collection, and can just reduce the overall ability of people to access and understand those files in the future. Another thing that Becker and Nogues talk about quite a bit is the saving over of files. So rather than saving discrete drafts of a file, records creators and especially authors, which is what this article is focused on, will just hit Control S when they want to save their changes, and that will override the the file that the writer was working with. So rather than having a bunch of files that show how a manuscript is developed over time, we just have this end file, and a lot of the information over how a manuscript or a play or a product has developed as someone has worked on it has been lost. And obviously that can be important contextual information for researchers to know. That's why researchers love seeing things that are annotated and things that really describe the creative process or the evolution of a product over time, because it gives people insights into what the creator was thinking, how what they're looking at now differs from a product in its original inception, and what kind of factors have shaped that product during the course of its creation. I would say that saving over these days is less of an issue because at least Microsoft Word has a version history where you can go in and look at different versions of a file that you're working on and track how it's changed over time. So if those different versions could be captured and maintained by archives in some way, that would show how at least a Word document has evolved over time. I don't know if there's something like that for other file formats or even other applications that aren't Microsoft Word, but that at least gives hope that there might be some record of how at least Word documents have changed over time. And since so many people use Word doc, you know, that's a pretty big step in the right direction. But it's not necessarily true for all applications, as I noted, and it does involve an awareness by records creators and by archivists as well that these other versions may exist and that they are important to protect and bring into an archive. So value is an interesting concept, and it's something that the Becker and Noakes article talks about a fair amount. And so they argue that there's some connection between how valued records are and the level of benign neglect that they'll receive. So if a records creator is producing a record that they feel will be important and that they feel will have value for them, either personally or for society in some way, then they're more likely to make sure that files stay in file formats that are current. They're more likely to take steps to document different versions of what they're creating. They're more likely to make sure that their files are named in a way that allows them to access the files readily in the future. This isn't an absolute rule, as the Becker and Noakes article notes. They talk about how in the moment, benign neglect may impact even records that are thought of as being valuable. You know, I take a lot of pictures of my daughter because she's cute and I love her, but I still don't go through and make sure that all those photos are, you know, have titles that reflect what was going on when they were taken. So even though they're valuable to me and even though my daughter is valuable to me, sort of in the moment, I don't really think of the importance of recording those details. Now, some of it is recorded in metadata, fortunately, but you know, I'm sure if I went back and looked at some of them, I'd be like, I have no idea, you know, what was going on in this picture because I haven't taken the time to name them in a way which will make that information more apparent to me now and in the future as well. So this isn't an absolute an absolute connection by any stretch of the imagination, especially when you consider how many records people, produce within, a day or a year. It's really difficult to want to keep up with all of them, no matter how important you think that they might be. One way that archivists can make researchers aware of the value of their records is by having a strong relationship with them. And intervening early on in the process to make sure that donors who will hopefully be donating their records to an archive in the future are not practicing benign neglect and are creating personal archives that are informative and readily accessible in the future. So a big part of this is working with donors to increase trust. As I talked about before, personal archives can oftentimes be very emotional and intense and can document very important parts of a person's life. They may be private. And so it's really helpful for archives to work with donors to increase trust. And by doing so, reduce some of the self-censorship and the archiving eye processes that I touched on before. And this can result in higher value research collections, again, because collections that come into archives haven't been leached of all the rich and useful information contained within them. Another important way that archives can intervene is working with donors to learn about records. So learning about which records are more valuable, which records should really be focuses of interventions, and which records have the research value that archives are interested in maintaining and providing into the future. So again, doing this can result in higher research value collections because information hasn't been lost over time. The records aren't in degraded shape before they or when they arrive into archives. And having this information, as we've talked about in class before, can support a lot of really important archival activities such as appraisal, arrangement, description, reference, preservation, and so on. And archives can also intervene by working with donors to preserve electronic records. So again, having this relationship where archives understand why records were created, what they were used for, making sure that the metadata that's important for digital preservation is attached to records, and that overall the records come into archival care in a way that is easy for archives to maintain and provide access to as possible. And this also can result in collections that are of higher research value and are more useful to researchers and are more able to communicate the importance of archives to society and to resource allocators. What's interesting is in the Becker and Oakes article, they describe the failure of archivists to intervene and work with records creators prior to donation as a form of benign neglect. So they're saying if archives don't engage in these interventions and don't work with donors to make sure that important information is preserved and the information coming into archives is accessible in the future, they themselves are engaging in this type of neglect that archivists might look at records creators and say, oh, well, why are you doing this? Well, if archives don't intervene, we're doing exactly the same thing. and we are practicing a form of neglect when it comes to archival records, and we are preventing the collection and accessibility of records that have high research value. And it's so important that this intervention takes place. As Becker and Oakes argues on page 499, there's really a small chance that people with no archival training will manage files in a way that prevents the loss of files and makes them easily discoverable. So people aren't just going to do this on their own. There has to be some intervention by archivists to make sure that that records are kept in a way that supports their long-term preservation and accessibility. On page 492, Becker notes caution that there should be some kind of balance between intervention and allowing records to maintain their evidentiary quality. So if archives intervene too much, perhaps that can undermine the evidentiary value of records and of personal archives. But it's still important for archivists to have some relationship with donors and some role in shaping what collections end up in archives in the future. Even if it results in records that, or a collection of records that isn't organic or impartial, which as we've discussed before, are pretty outdated terms when it comes to archives, it can really improve the breadth and depth of information about a records creator that survives, and again can result in collections that have higher research value. So obviously this has some pretty strong continuum model foundations. So again, the idea of working with records creators as close to the creation of records as possible to make sure that they are preserved in a way, that they're described in a way that makes them more accessible when they come into archives, and not waiting for records to be appraised by archives before that kind of intervention or interaction takes place. So I'll wrap things up by talking about some different types of curatorship in archives as it relates to personal archives. So obviously when you look at creation by the individual, it's traditionally named as the curator, creation by communities, and creation by custodians. These can be the coaxers and coercers that can engage in archiving eye processes and can shape the archived eye of a person that is represented in archival collections. So they can have a big role in shaping what personal archives in an archive actually look like and how well they represent the actual life and actions of an individual. Creation by archivists. As I talked about before, archives can choose or not to choose to intervene with records creators in a way that is going to facilitate the development of personal archives that are easily accessible, that have strong informational content, that are higher quality, have higher value, and overall have more of a benefit for archives and for society as a whole. If archives choose not to intervene, then it can result in a loss of a lot of information, which can be important and which can shape social memory in a particular way. So if archives don't intervene and that results in someone deleting details about a part of their life, which may be very important, then that information may never come to light. And the social memory that is sort of derived from that archival collection can be very flawed and very inaccurate. So archivists really have a choice to intervene and not to intervene, especially with personal archives, and that can really impact what picture of a person survives into the future. So personal archives can be very fascinating. You know, whether you realize it or not, you have a personal archive. You have a collection of records somewhere in some shape that documents you and what you've experienced. And maybe it's something that you have curated quite actively, and maybe it's something that you've just kind of accumulated over time and you haven't really put much thought into it, but it's there. And it can be a very powerful representation of who you are and what you think and what you've experienced. And, you know, it can be something that is very personal, and maybe something that you would be reluctant to have other people looking at unless you were donating those materials to an organization that you trusted and that you felt would act fairly and in the best interests of you and in the best interests of society. And again, that's why it's so important that people trust archives and people feel comfortable donating personal materials to archives and allowing those materials and the information that those materials contain to continue to exist now and into the future. So we'll leave our discussion of personal archives there. I hope that you've enjoyed reading about them and learning about them, and maybe thinking about them more or differently than you have before. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions, and stay safe out there.